Business executives move for Vietnam peace invite you to hear excerpts of addresses by United States Senator from Kentucky, Thurston B. Martin, and the Honorable Mariner S. Eccles, former chairman the Federal Reserve Board under Presidents Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman. Senator Morton and Mr. Eccles are addressing sessions of a national conference of business executives move for Vietnam peace. Business executives from throughout the United States are participating in the national conference, which is being held in Washington, D.C. Now, United States Senator from Kentucky, Thurston B. Martin.
Now, in the last 3 years, have witnessed a disastrous decline, in my opinion, in the effectiveness of American foreign policy. And I think the root cause of the trouble is the bankruptcy of our position in Vietnam. President Eisenhower warned in his famous farewell address of the dangers of too much power and too much influence in the hands of a military-industrial complex. I believe that President Johnson was brainwashed, if I may use that word that's achieved some degree of publicity, by this power center as early as 1961, when, as vice president, he ventured to Saigon on a fact-finding mission. I believe he has been mistakenly committed to a military solution in Vietnam for the past 5 years, with only a brief pause during the election campaign of 1964 to brainwash the American people with, I quote, "The war in Vietnam ought to be fought by Asian boys." Now, if the President of the United States has been mistaken, so have I. In early 1965, when the President began to escalate the war, I supported the increased American involvement, and I was wrong. I am convinced that unless we gradually and, if necessary, unilaterally reduce the scope of our military involvement, we may destroy the very society that we sought to save, with absolutely no claim to expertise or originality. I believe the United States should consider the following. Number one, an immediate cessation of all bombing of North Vietnam. I believe that an indefinite bombing halt just might encourage Hanoi to talk, and I believe we must give it a try. And I use the word indefinite deliberately and not the word permanent. Number two, an end to all search and destroy missions. The price has not been worth the accomplishments. Furthermore, the cost in civilian casualties and disruptions only adds to the growing disaffection of the Vietnamese population toward the so-called American saviors. Number three, a gradual concentration of effort to secure the coastal and the population centers of South Vietnam, where a vast majority of the people live. This can and must be accomplished with a substantial reduction in American troop strength. The overpresence of our forces has contributed to a mounting tide of anti-Americanism among the Vietnamese populace. Number four, increased pressure upon the Saigon government to negotiate and to institute widespread reform. We can encourage reform, but we cannot impose a military occupation or a colonial government. Number five, an internal and regional settlement. The thrust toward negotiations, the thrust toward a ceasefire, and toward a long-range solution to the conflict that has torn the entire Indo-Chinese peninsula asunder for a generation has to be initiated locally. A climate for talks must be developed by Asians themselves. We must do more, in my opinion, to encourage them And my final point, the administration should precisely state to Hanoi and the world that our unilateral disengagement seeks an appropriate response. Let there be no doubt in any quarter that while we take the first steps down the long and tortuous road toward peace in Vietnam, we pray for an equally peaceful response. Let there be no doubt upon whose shoulders will lie the responsibility for continued chaos and devastation should our efforts toward peace fail.
Here now, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, the Honorable Mariner S. Eccles, and moves for Vietnam peace.
What are the reasons and the justification, if any, for our involvement in Vietnam? The Johnson administration believes that the war in Vietnam is being made solely by communist intervention from without. The administration sees every rebellion as the result of a deep plot out of Moscow or Peking, when it usually is the result of crushing poverty, hunger, and intolerable living conditions. How can we reconcile what we are doing to South Vietnam under the guise of saving them from communism? We have destroyed vast areas of their country. We have killed, wounded, or burned hundreds of thousands of children, as well as countless parents, brothers, husbands, and sons. The family has been smashed. No wonder the great majority of the people do not consider us their saviors, but hate us and want us to get out of their country. What is the effect of the Vietnam policy on the nation? It is causing the huge federal deficit. The war is creating inflationary pressures in nearly every field, a great shortage of skilled workers, increasing strife, and higher interest rates in all categories due to the heavy demand for credit. The costs of the war do not end with the cessation of hostilities. Total veterans benefits paid to the end of '65 were $134 billion. By the end of this year, it is estimated they will be $147 billion. In the financial sense, a war is never over. But the real tragedy is not financial. It is the useless suffering of millions of our people whose sons, husbands, and brothers are drawn into the useless conflict unwillingly and are killed and maimed for life, not in defense of their country, but because of our incompetent and ill-advised leadership. While we've been spending tens of billions abroad, our cities are exploding in violent protest as a result of our injustice, neglect, and failure to meet the unfulfilled promises of our great society. The Vietnam debacle, tragic as it is, may yet be a blessing in disguise if it forces us to recognize our own staggering failures at home. Runaway crime, delinquencies, riot in our cities, loss of respect for law and order, and the rebellion of frustrated youth all spring in part from this. It is pathetic that the most powerful country in the world, with 6% of its population and producing 40% of its wealth, should have lost the respect of most of the world. The world, with few exceptions, would like us to leave Vietnam. The greatest service that we could render the Vietnamese is to withdraw from their country, leaving them to negotiate a conclusion of the war which is their right. History does not show that a nation that liquidates a bad venture suffers from loss of prestige. Proud, powerful England surrendered to the 13 American colonies and did not suffer for it. France moved out voluntarily of Algeria and Indochina. Today, France has more world prestige than ever before. Russia pulled her missiles out of Cuba. Its prestige did not suffer. We should be less interested in saving face and more interested in saving lives. What can we expect from the stricken Vietnamese nation but hatred, deep and abiding? Their farms and villages have been laid waste. Their husbands and sons are dead, maimed, or missing, and children, orphaned and grotesquely burned, have been seen running in packs through some of the rubble. We can never blot out the deed that stands as a testimony of man's inhumanity to man. Nor can we really make amends for the enormity of our crime against these people who know us not, but whom we have chosen to save from communism. But we can try. We can make a beginning. And in conscience, how can that beginning be less than immediate withdrawal of our evil presence? Of our evil presence, because that is what it has proved to be in the lives of the Vietnamese. And we can humbly, with vigor and never ceasing, do everything in our power, in the power of a rich and a repentant nation, to heal, to rebuild, and to reassure. The Vietnamese will never forget us, and it is to be hoped that we will never forget the Vietnamese, because it is this Vietnam tragedy which has shown us ourselves as others see us, a nation to be feared instead of loved, flushed with pride and sure of omnipotence, an arrogant nation, not qualified to handle power wisely. While the hour is late, it is not yet impossible to turn the page. Men and nations have made new beginnings before, and out of defeat there has often come victory. And what a victory it could be for this nation, so abundantly endowed, to reverse its image, make itself loved, admired, and revered, so that it could stand forth before the emerging people around the globe as an example of what they might wish to become. But the road is long, and we must win much forgiveness. So let us begin.
You have just heard Moves for Vietnam Peace, excerpts from addresses given by United States Senator from Kentucky, Thurston B. Morton, and the Honorable Mariner S. Eccles, former chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Senator Morton and Mr. Eccles spoke to sessions of a national conference of business executives Move for Vietnam Peace. This program came to you from Washington, D.C. Your announcer, Leo Orso.